Nathan Bauer comes to the U.S. via, as he puts it, the Great White North. He has bachelor's in history and philosophy from the University of Calgary and McGill University in Montreal, respectively. He then received his PhD from the University of Chicago in 2008 in philosophy. Since then, he has published articles on Kant's theoretical philosophy in Inquiry and the British Journal for the History of Philosophy, and he has more in the pipeline, as he tells us. And also, in an attempt to broaden his interests, he is currently working on two neo-Kantian projects. One, Departed Souls, an non-Kantian, sorry. Yes, Neo-Kantian would be different. That's everything that he already does. We know that. Anyway, the non-Kantian stuff is Departed Souls, an examination of Plato's apparent rejection of the tripartite soul at the end of the Republic, and another one called Justice at the Margins, which was the subject of a talk that he gave in the fall of 2013 in this series, employing social contract theory to consider the political status of animals. He also, of course, is a very, sort of valued member of our faculty in the Philosophy and Religious Studies department, teaches courses on Kant and also a lot of in history and philosophy of science. And I would like to, and today he's going to speak to us on the subject of dealing with Kant's racism, and I would ask that you all welcome Professor Bauer.
Thanks, everyone. All right, so Alfred North Whitehead famously remarked that all of philosophy is but footnotes to Plato. Well, maybe. But if we set aside the Greeks, it's pretty easy to identify the most important and influential philosopher of our modern era. It's this guy.
Whoa, impressive.
I should just call it quits right here. That would be Herr Dr. Immanuel Kant. Like Plato, the sage of Königsberg has had a remarkable impact on almost every area of philosophy. Logic, metaphysics, theories of knowledge, ethics and political philosophy, aesthetics, and on and on. Moreover, he continues to play a prominent role in today's debates in these fields. Now, I spend a fair bit of my time here at Rowan extolling the virtues of Kant to everyone I see. Those of you, and quite a few of you are here who attend the student club, know all about this, that I'm always sort of pushing this line. Today things are going to be a little bit different. We'll be peering into a less pleasant corner of Kant's career, namely his views on race. And simply put, I'll avoid any suspense here. Kant was a committed and enthusiastic racist. Scholars of Kant do tend to downplay this, focusing on the parts of his system that they think have more enduring value. But it's there, and it's prominent in much of his work. Kant published several essays specifically devoted to race, and he also taught on this topic throughout his career. So he did courses on geography and anthropology, and from beginning to end of this career, race comes up a lot, quite clearly, and frankly in really ugly ways. So for me, a sympathetic Kantian, it was very painful to discover the extent of Kant's racism. And in fact, this was the working title for my talk over the last few months. So I'll just say this right now. I've tried to throw in a bit of humor into this talk, which is a little bit weird because it's a dark topic, but I find it sort of easier to deal with it that way. And I also just want to confess up front that personally, I always get a little bit nervous talking about race. It's not easy. I'm always afraid that I'll say something stupid or hurtful by mistake. And also, just as a white male, I have lived much of my life in a sort of cocoon of privilege. And part of this privilege means not necessarily having to understand the scope and pervasiveness of racism, both today and also its historical origins, right? So since being awakened from my dogmatic slumber about some of this, I've really been trying to better understand these issues. But I'll just say up front, I am hardly an expert in this area. I hope I'm sort of an expert on Kant, but I'm certainly not an expert in race. So this is me as a Kantian trying to engage with some of this stuff as best I can. All right, so when I say Kant was a racist, what exactly do I mean? First, some context. So this is the city of Königsberg. Kant lived in this then thriving Baltic port city in the late 1700s. Although he really never traveled a tiny bit, but really not very much. Kant was intensely interested in learning about the world beyond him. This was an age of discovery, and living in a port city, he had easy access to the latest tales of exploration in Africa, the Americas, and the South Pacific. So, for example, Kant avidly read these reports of European encounters with local populations, and then he wrote about them a lot in what looks to be a very unhealthy mix of gullibility and confirmation bias. Kant used these stories to develop a very elaborate hierarchical view of the racial divisions of humanity. So I want to walk us through a few examples of this, and I should just warn you up front, the passages are disturbing and the language is derogatory, but I think it's important we're sort of clear on what we're dealing with here. So let's start with a passage from Kant's Lectures on Geography. The dating for this is tricky because there's a whole long story about how this stuff ended up being published. But Kant, we know Kant taught this course regularly for decades, and it comes from that sort of teaching. So here he writes, humanity is in its greatest perfection in the white race. The yellow Indians already have a lesser talent. The Negroes are much lower, and lowest of all is part of the American peoples. So here we have a very straightforward, typical racist hierarchy. Caucasians at the top, Asians below, followed by Africans and American Indians. People would debate about the exact order of this, but this is sort of a standard thing you find in these racist accounts. And there's, like, this is just one of many, many, many places where he says stuff like this. Another example comes from a work written later, we think later, in 1788, which would put us right at the sort of high point of his philosophical activity. So referring this time to American Indians, Kant writes, that their natural disposition did not achieve a perfect suitability for any climate can be seen from the circumstance that hardly any reason can be given for why this race, which is too weak for hard labor, too indifferent for industry, and incapable of any culture, although there's enough of it as an example and encouragement nearby, ranks still far below even the Negro, who stands on the lowest of all the other steps that we've named as differences of the races. So this is just very nasty, ugly stuff, right? Here's another one from his 1764 work on the feeling of the beautiful and the sublime. It's a little earlier. This time, Kant managed to combine racism and sexism in a single repulsive passage. So he says, indeed, Father Labat reports that a Negro carpenter, whom he reproached for haughty treatment of his wives, replied, you whites are real fools. For first you concede so much to your wives, and then you complain that they drive you crazy. There might be something here worth considering, except for the fact that this scoundrel was completely black from head to foot, a distinct proof that what he said was stupid. It's just horrible. I really could go on for days probably, just dredging this stuff up, but I hope this at least captures sort of the ugly flavor of his views. There's just frankly a ton of racism and misogyny throughout in Kant's writings from the very beginning of his career to the end. So that Kant was a racist isn't terribly surprising. Most 18th century Europeans were, but this doesn't get him off the hook. It doesn't make it any less reprehensible, and it's worth noting that some of Kant's contemporaries were able to escape this sort of prejudice, right? It wasn't universal. Moreover, it would be a mistake to downplay the significance of Kant's racism by portraying him as simply a product of his time. Kant did not just reflect the prejudices of his era. He actually wrote actively on race, and here his work was quite influential in the development of the sort of pseudoscience of racial hierarchy that came to dominate European thought in the centuries ahead. So he wasn't just sort of a passively receiving this stuff, he was actively contributing to it and played an important role there. Kant's work provided intellectual cover for slavery and a variety of other immoral colonial practices, many of which continue to affect us today. And there's really just no question that Kant deserves a lot of blame for this. And for me personally, I found it very painful sort of just dealing with this, because Kant is a philosopher I like, and even his personality, there's parts of it I like. And so it was just sort of the worst kind of revelation to learn just how complicit Kant was in this tradition. All right, so as I mentioned earlier, Kant scholars do tend to downplay this stuff, pushing it aside to gather dust on the fringes of Kant's corpus, next to stuff like his bizarre speculations on the nature of earthquakes or his confident belief in life on other planets. Kant had a lot of strange views, and there's a tendency to just sort of push this to the side with all that stuff. But I think this is a mistake. We really should confront Kant's racism directly. And his racism is especially troubling when we consider it in relation to his ethics, right? Because after all, why should we trust Kant as a guide to understanding morality when he clearly falls so short of the good in his own moral life, right? So there's a tension between the philosophical view and the philosopher here. So that's worrisome, right? Now, one thought is, well, maybe this seems a little quick. Perhaps we don't need to dismiss Kant entirely as an ethical philosopher. And here it might be useful to draw a distinction between Kant's theory and his application of the theory. And indeed, we have reason to believe that Kant was really not always very good at the latter task. Kant was raised in a strict pietist family, and he really inherited a lot of their puritanical ways. And in particular, he had this tendency to sort of shoehorn his own beliefs into his theory, often in a fairly awkward way. And if you've taught Kant or read Kant at all, I think it's easy to come up with some examples of this. So here's one. For example, one of Kant's basic ethical principles is that we should never use other people merely as means to achieving our own ends, right? So for example, take this happy romantic couple. Now suppose the two of them opt for a night of passionate lovemaking. You wouldn't believe how long it took to set that up. Kant insists that this sort of non-procreative sex is always immoral because it involves using another person in order to satisfy your own pleasures. But if you think about this at all, this is just very weird. Not only does it show how little Kant knew about sex, sadly, like far too many philosophers, he died a virgin. But it's also just a totally implausible application of the theory. I'll leave it to each of you to consider how sex can involve a genuine concern for the other person or people involved. All right, but enough about sex, back to racism. So the hope is perhaps we can draw the same distinction between theory and application here. Kant's theory defends the equality of all humans, and more on that soon. But in applying this theory, unfortunately, Kant falls painfully short of this ideal, failing to extend equal moral status to those who aren't white males. Now, it's not hard to find reasons for why Kant would be better at theorizing than applying theory. After all, the two tasks do involve different skill sets, one quite abstract, the other more concrete and specific. And again, if you've dealt with Kant before, Kant was definitely not good with the concrete. He once bragged about how few examples he provided to support his theoretical claims, so he took a sort of pride in the abstract quality of his work. Moreover, it makes sense that biases would be more likely to creep in at the application stage, for it's precisely then that conflicts tend to arise with your pre-philosophical commitments, right? Because now you're sort of getting down to what you should actually do and what's right and what's wrong. So it makes sense that application would be more challenging. So far what I'm suggesting is that we might try to insulate good Kant, the brilliant theorist on the nature of morality, from bad Kant, the ugly defender of a pseudoscientific racism. So the thought is Kant's racism might just involve a misapplication of his theory rather than being a problem with the theory itself. So that's sort of an initial position. Recently, however, a number of scholars have argued that we can't save good Kant from bad Kant. Racism, they claim, goes to the very heart of Kant's ethical theory, and there's just no way to surgically remove it without killing the patient. So this is the sort of challenge I'm interested in, this claim that you can't just dismiss the racism as an application problem. It's built into the theory itself in some way. One of the first scholars to raise this charge was a post-colonial philosopher with the ironic name Immanuel Kant. There are no high-resolution photos of him anywhere on the internet that I could find, so that's the best I could do. In his 2001 book, Achieving Our Humanity, and in some related articles, it argues that for Kant, the racial hierarchy of humans is transcendentally grounded. So that's some Kantian lingo. Basically, he's saying it's a core aspect of his account of human nature and morality. So Eiza explains, Kant's analysis reproduced Linnaeus's division of humans, physical, cultural, geographical, and temperamental, but situated them transcendentally on an axis that permanently links moral character to racial classes. So the charge is you just cannot separate the racial views from the ethical theory here. More recently, the prominent political philosopher Charles Mills has taken up this charge. In a 2002 lecture later published as Kant's Untermenschen, Mills writes, what I am suggesting then is that Kant's racism should be seen as a normative system in its own right, that makes whiteness a prerequisite for full personhood and generally limits non-whites to sub-person status. So the idea here defended by both Eiza and Mills is that racism is not an application error at all. Rather, it stems directly from Kant's theory-based denial of full moral agency to non-whites. So while still biologically human, members of these other races do not count for moral purposes as proper persons. That's what Kant's being charged with here. Now, if you've read much Kant, this charge might initially sound kind of surprising. Kant is famous for his universal moral claims that all people deserve to be treated with respect and that all humans have equal moral status. Nonetheless, as Mills rightly points out here, Kant's use of such language hardly settles the issue. And some people have tried to dismiss this charge just on the sort of basis of that language, right? But Mills thinks that there's no way that works because the language can be misleading. And after all, think of our founding fathers, right, who were happy to proclaim freedom for all, even as they accepted slavery and denied civil rights to women, right? So you can't just base it on the language. You have to look at the theory itself. And here I should just confess something. In the many years I've been studying Kant's ethics, Eiza and Mills' objection really never occurred to me. So it was sort of a surprise to encounter this. There's been little discussion of it in the tiny world of Kant scholars. There's a little bit more now, but it's a fairly recent development. But in the broader world of ethics, political philosophy, and cultural theory, I think this is a pretty widely held view, that Kant's ethical theory is fundamentally marred by racism. I actually discovered this in a very helpful Facebook exchange last year, which involved Dr. Kazarian and a number of our mutual friends, which proves, if nothing else, that Facebook is more than just kittens and Donald Trump video links. Anyways, it was this conversation, I think unresolved at the time, that sort of inspired the work that led to this talk, sort of following up on that. All right, so again, the charge is that hidden behind Kant's appealing, universal-sounding language is a definition of personhood that deliberately excludes non-white people. Now, one might think that Kant is an unlikely target for this accusation. For other philosophers, such as David Hume, morality is all about our natural physical desires, which could easily vary from one group to another. Kant, however, is famously the philosopher of reason, which ought to be detached from our bodily materiality. It's tempting to think of the Kantian moral agent as disembodied rationality itself, right? A person for whom race could have no moral relevance. I don't think that's entirely wrong, but I also think things are not nearly as simple as that. For Kant, human ethics is not just about abstract rational thought, and I think it could be more helpful to think of it as almost like the sort of collision between reason and bodily desire. Like what you see here with St. Anthony suffering from his temptations. Indeed, human moral agents are interesting precisely because they include both rational and desiring faculties, these capacities we have. A battle constantly rages within us between our respect for what's morally right and our temptation to do what's wrong. And this is why ethics expresses itself for us humans in the form of duty or obligation. A force that is at once sort of internal but constraining. We feel it is something we have to do. Things are very different for other kinds of beings. Take animals, for instance. Two animals I know quite well. Animals are lacking in reason and thus are incapable of doing right or wrong. They're morally innocent. They don't face that same sort of conflict that we have. Angels, on the other hand, a favorite example of Kant's. Angels, if they exist, would lack any physical desires. They only do what's good, meaning they're ethically boring. There's just no sort of ethical conflict there at all. Humans, with their mix of reason and bodily desire, are actually very morally interesting. And because there is this material element to our ethical lives, there's potentially room in Kant's account for human differences to play a role. And now Kant, being unfortunately badly informed on the empirical facts of human difference, makes a lot of harmful remarks on the moral character of different peoples. Consider, for example, his thoughts on the Tahitians. Drawing upon unreliable voyage narratives from Captains Wallace and Cook, among others, Kant claims that these island natives are just too lazy to perfect their talents. And there's a sort of famous example of this. But the general problem is really one we all face in holding people morally responsible for their actions. For example, if a person is just naturally more prone to anger, it'll be harder for them to treat others fairly and with respect. Does this mean we let them off the hook when they behave badly? Well, there may be extreme cases where we do withhold blame in these situations. But this really gets us into difficult philosophical territory. How do we make that call? How do we account for those sorts of material differences in assessing people's moral responsibility? However, there's one point that Kant always insists on. Humans are fundamentally characterized by freedom. And what this means is that we all find within us a power to do what's right, no matter how much we're tempted to do otherwise. Reason, and Kant's really committed to this, can vanquish every inappropriate desire. Thus, physical variations in humans should really only make a limited difference in our ethical lives. What we hold in common is our rationality, which Kant believes makes us all equally deserving of moral respect. All right, so this brings us back to Mills and Eitzsche. Both of them argue that for Kant, reason itself has been racialized. So this is sort of the strong version of their charge, that even reason is not free of this. Certain races are said to be naturally inferior in rationality, and as a result, they're morally inferior too. So although Kant's theory is full of some nice universal sounding language, this turns out to be highly misleading, they think. When he says all people, what he really just means is all white men. Implicit in his account is an alternate category for non-European people who are not fully rational and thus not fully moral agents. So he never comes right out and says that, but their idea is if you combine the views on race with the claims in the ethics, that's sort of the concept that emerges. So Mills, borrowing from later Nazi terminology, provocatively calls this Kant's Untermenschen, his subhumans. And in the remainder of this talk, I'll be focusing on this specific charge. So that racism is inextricably tied to Kant's ethical theory because he sees reason itself as varying by race. And my response will have two parts, philosophical and textual. All right, so for me, on the philosophical side, a frustrating aspect of Eitzsche and Mills' argument is that it sort of limits itself to these fairly sweeping claims about what Kant means by the terms human, person, and so on, rather than sort of diving into the details of Kant's ethical theory. So this is one thing I think I can bring to this debate, is sort of see how the details of the theory affect our assessment of this charge. So when we examine Kant's ethics, we'll see that the rationality he invokes there is so simple and minimal that any functioning human being would have to possess it. That's what I want to try to convince you of. In other words, when we consider how reason actually functions in Kant's theory, we'll see that he can't coherently be denying it to some races. So I want to sort of walk you through a few basic features of Kant's account of morality. For Kant, there are two main roles for reason in ethics. First, it serves as a source of our moral value. So reason represents, here's a way of thinking about it, this isn't quite how Kant puts it, but reason represents our ability to step back from our desires, to question them, to interrogate them, and even at times to reject them. So if we think a desire is inappropriate, it's reason that allows us to say, I'm not going to act on that desire. So that's one sort of role it plays. Without reason, our actions would be based solely on which desire is strongest in us. There'd be no notion of the rightness or wrongness of what we choose to do. It would just be the strongest desire wins. But when reason appears on the scene, the thought is a whole new dimension of moral value opens up. And reason is the sort of source of that value. So that's sort of one aspect of his account. Now, along with providing the source of moral value, reason also plays a second role in Kant's theory. It allows us to determine which actions are right and wrong. Here, the key concept for Kant is rational consistency. This is what Kant has in mind with his notoriously confusing categorical imperative. That's probably the last technical term I'll use in this talk, but it's sort of his main moral concept. We each have a duty not to make an exception of ourselves. Immorality for Kant consists of a person wanting to ignore some rule while still insisting that all should obey it. It's an inconsistency in one's will, and thus a failure of rationality. So you want this rule to be true, but you don't want to have to obey it yourself. And that's just rationally inconsistent. Here are a few examples of how this works. First, stealing cars. So suppose I decide to swipe your shiny blue convertible. I'm effectively saying that I shouldn't be held to the general rule against car theft. My decision to do that, I'm saying, don't count me in on that rule, right? But despite that, I don't actually want it to be okay for everyone to steal cars. In fact, I'd be upset if someone went on to re-steal the car from me. Right? So in other words, I simultaneously believe that no one should steal cars and that it's okay for me to steal cars. My will in that sense is rationally inconsistent. Those two beliefs do not fit together rationally, and it's this that makes my car theft immoral, or my decision to do that. So that's one example. Here's another. We generally believe that it's morally good to help others. So Kant asks, could I live by the general rule, don't help others? Could that be moral, right? He thinks not. Being finite, I know that situations could inevitably arise in which I would ask for the help of others, and I know that about me. What this shows is that I want the general rule of helping others to remain in place while simultaneously allowing myself to break it. As with the car thief, the will of the person who doesn't wish to help others is rationally inconsistent. And in recognizing this inconsistency, it's by recognizing that inconsistency that we see that we actually do have a duty to help others. So it just comes from our rationality of our will. We want our beliefs to cohere together consistently. So now that we have both of these roles for reason in place, I want to draw your attention to a few important features of reason that sort of follow from it playing these roles. So first and most important, moral reasoning for Kant is easy. As he explains, here it would be easy to show how common human reason, with this compass in hand, knows very well how to distinguish, in every case that comes up, what's good and what's evil, what's in conformity with duty, what's contrary to duty, if, without in the least teaching it anything new, we only as did Socrates, make it attentive to its own principle, and that there is accordingly no need of science and philosophy to know what one has to do in order to be honest and good. And he says this again and again in all of his ethical writings. Being moral is easy. Why? It's easy because morality doesn't require any sophisticated logical maneuvering. It consists of very basic logical tests. Am I holding myself to different standards than others? Am I using others simply as a means to my own ends? If so, then I'm being immoral. Kant repeatedly emphasizes this point. There are no impressive feats of reasoning involved here. His categorical imperative and all the sort of technical language attached to that is just a very precise way of specifying what everyone is already doing pre-philosophically when they decide questions of right and wrong. Kant insists again and again that he doesn't mean to change the way people make moral judgments. It's just not part of his philosophical program. So he's just trying to describe it in a precise way. But the moral reasoning itself, he thinks, is easy. A second and related feature of Kant's ethics is that it doesn't help to be extra rational. All that you need is the easy rationality required to examine one's will. Beyond this minimal threshold, any surplus of reason makes no moral difference. As Kant puts it, in practical matters, common human understanding can even have as good a hope of hitting the mark as any philosopher can promise himself. Indeed, it is almost more sure in this matter because a philosopher can easily confuse his judgment by a mass of considerations foreign and irrelevant to the matter and deflect it from the straight course. In other words, you don't need to be a genius to be moral. The slide, that's nice, right? Einstein's giant brain does not give him any special moral status over the rest of us. We can tell right from wrong just as well as he can. Now, it needs to be stressed, the easiness of achieving the criterion of rationality is not an incidental feature of Kant's theory. Rather, it's absolutely essential to how he understands morality. And here it's helpful, I think, to note the influence of another philosopher, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. There he is. It was Rousseau who convinced Kant that all humans have the same moral status, a fairly radical view at the time. And Kant was quite clear about his debt to the French philosopher. This wasn't published, but this is in sort of his marginal remarks. It's a very nice little passage. There was a time when I believed that knowledge alone could constitute the honor of mankind, and I had contempt for the rabble who know nothing. Rousseau brought me around. This blinding superiority disappeared. I learned to honor human beings. And I would find myself far more useless than the common laborer if I did not believe that this consideration could impart to all others a value in establishing the rights of humanity. And this idea of equality was really in sharp contrast with a lot of traditional ethics at this time, which tended to dismiss the common folk as morally inferior. It was Rousseau and Kant, among others, who helped secure this idea of moral universalism. In fact, the principle is now seen as so self-evident that we tend to forget, I think, the significance of their achievement here. Now, how does this connect back to racism? Of course, it's true that appeals to rationality have often been used as a way to arbitrarily exclude certain groups of people. Notoriously so, right? But Kant actually seems to be doing the opposite, for he's deliberately invoking a minimal notion of rationality in his moral theory. He insists that recognizing our moral duties is easy to do, that it requires no special knowledge or intelligence, that people are doing it all the time without any aid from philosophy. In other words, his theory is a move toward egalitarianism, not away from it. So it's not enough for H.A. Mills and others to point out that Kant falsely accused some human races of being less intelligent than others. And again, he certainly deserves condemnation for that. To defend their objection, they would need to show that Kant saw these people as incapable of very basic cognitive functions. Stuff like positing a rule and then acting on it, or recognizing that two beliefs conflict with each other in a fairly obvious way. In short, Kant could exclude other races from morality only by denying them this basic minimal rationality. And I think this is just utterly implausible. Only infants and maybe the severely mentally damaged would lack the minimal rationality he requires. If that's right, then there's just no conceptual space for Mill's subhumans in Kantian ethics. Kant's racism obviously deserves condemnation, severely so, but it doesn't contaminate the theory itself. So that's my philosophical defense of Kant's theory, and I just want to briefly give some textual evidence for my reading. So here's a question. Is there textual evidence for my reading? There is. In fact, there's lots of it. Despite Kant's racist inclinations, he consistently includes non-European peoples within the moral sphere. He sees them as morally responsible for their actions, and he insists that they're deserving of respectful treatment from others. So, take, for example, his views on colonialism. You should brace yourself. This is an example of Kant's abuse of the German language translated into English. I'll do the best I can here. But it's an interesting point he makes here. Lastly, it can still be asked whether, when neither nature nor chance, but just our own will brings us into the neighborhood of a people that hold out no prospect of a civil union with it, so whether we should not be authorized to found colonies, by force if need be, in order to establish a civil union with them, and bring these men, savages, into a rightful condition, as with the American Indians, the Hottentots, and the inhabitants of New Holland. Or, which is not much better, to found colonies by fraudulent purchase of their land and so become owners of their land, making use of our superiority with regard to for their first possession. Should we not be authorized to do this, especially since nature itself, which abhors a vacuum, seems to demand it, and great expanses of land in other parts of the world, which are now splendidly populated, would have otherwise remained uninhabited by civilized people, or indeed would have to remain forever uninhabited, so that the end of creation would have been frustrated. Got all that? So far, that doesn't sound very good for Kant. Fortunately, he continues. But it's easy to see through this veil of injustice, Jesuitism. He has to put in a religious stig there, which would sanction any means to good ends. Such a way of acquiring land is therefore to be repudiated. So colonialism, he is not a fan of there. In other words, Kant is quite clear that Europeans have an obligation to deal fairly with the people they encounter in new lands. A little later, he states this again quite definitively. Colonial settlement may not take place by force, but only by contract, and indeed by a contract that doesn't take advantage of the ignorance of these inhabitants with respect to ceding their lands. There are many more examples of these passages, all of which I think are flatly inconsistent with Eitzé and Mill's claims. And even some of Kant's more racist remarks still presuppose that his ethical theory applies to all humans. For example, he argues that it would be deeply immoral to live a life devoted solely to leisure without trying to improve yourself. And you get the feeling that that's the worst sin for Kant, is sort of the life of leisure. To show that this proposed principle is wrong, Kant chooses Polynesian natives as his example. He writes, "A nature could indeed always subsist with such a universal law," so this life of leisure, "although, as with the South Sea Islanders, the human being should let his talents rust and be concerned with devoting his life merely to idleness, amusement, procreation, in a word, to enjoyment. Only he cannot possibly will that this becomes a universal law." Now, this is obviously insulting to Polynesian peoples and empirically false. It's also just a weird sort of application of his theory again, I think. But ironically, Kant's moral condemnation of the islanders shows that he considered them legitimate moral agents. After all, subhumans would be outside the sphere of morality. You don't condemn your dog for living a leisurely life. They're just not in that sphere. If they're outside the sphere of morality, they couldn't be held responsible for their actions. This and other examples, and again, there's plenty of them, provide clear and I think decisive evidence against the claims of Eitzé and Mills. Now, Kant's views on morality evolved over time. Early on, he shared the then common view that people differed greatly in their ethical value. He had a kind of moral disgust for commoners. Based on Rousseau's influence, as I noted, Kant came to reject this position. Instead, he embraces the idea that all humans have the same moral status. But despite this, and this is just a perplexing thing, Kant did not cease to be a racist. And he continues to express his racism in his anthropological works to the end of his life. As I see it, this is just in painful tension with his mature ethical views. But, and this is the key point I want to bring out, the core ethical texts are consistent and clear. All humans, regardless of race, belong fully in the moral sphere. All right, I'm almost done here. So why am I making such a fuss to save Kant's ethical theory from his own racism? To wrap things up, I'd like to step back for a moment to consider the big picture. Kant belongs to the age of enlightenment. In fact, he's surely its most important member. I myself consider myself a somewhat old-fashioned defender of Enlightenment rationality. But it's worth noting the Enlightenment is not terribly popular today. This intellectual movement has often been saddled with the ugly history of European colonialism. Here's a recent example, quite recent fairly recent from the New York Times, by the philosopher Justin E.H. Smith. The question for us today is why we have chosen to stick with categories inherited from the 18th century, the century of the so-called Enlightenment, which witnessed the development of the slave trade into the very foundation of the global economy, and at the same time saw racial classifications congeal into pseudo-biological kinds, piggybacking on the divisions of folk science had always made across the natural world of plants and animals. Why, that is, have we chosen to go with Hume and Kant? I get the concern, but I think this is a mistake. The evils of colonial and now post-colonial racism are not best understood as products of Enlightenment thought. Rather, they reflect our shameful failure to live up to these ideals. Colonialism, slavery, Jim Crow, the many policies today that continue to reinforce racial inequality. Our society's moral failures come from not following Enlightenment reason. They come not from following Enlightenment reason, but from too often ignoring it. We live brief lives, and our view of human history is inevitably short-sighted. The Enlightenment project of emancipating humanity from its ignorance and superstition has really only just begun. We should certainly complain that progress has not come more quickly, but the fact that we haven't yet fully realized these ideals is, in my opinion, no reason to abandon them. I believe that Kant's rational, universalizing ethics is actually a valuable tool for combating racism. I thus see it as unfortunate and a little ironic that some theorists and activists in the fight against racism have been too willing to abandon this tool. Now, Kant also provides some insight into why the fight for equality has been so difficult. It's my last slide. We shouldn't be overly surprised by these setbacks, he thinks. As humans, we know what we should do, but we're constantly tempted away from it. As Kant famously remarked, out of the crooked timber of humanity, nothing straight was ever made. Kant was well aware that human progress is frustratingly slow and imperfect. Unfortunately, this truth applies all too well to Kant himself. Thanks.
So I never realized that Kant thought that morality was easy. But suppose when I think about morality, it's not easy for many situations. Yeah. And part of the difficulty is when I make a moral judgment, I'm not sure, the factual questions, I'm not sure, is this a person or not a person when I'm thinking of something like abortion, for example.
Yeah.
So how could he say something like, it seems like your response assumes that it has to be easy, but it just seems that's ridiculous for many cases.
So I think there's room for Kant to say something like, I don't think he says this. He does just think it's always easy, and I think he's a little bit naive about that. But there's a sense in which it's easy, and there's a sense in which it's hard, and we need to keep these separated. The sense in which it's hard is that it's often difficult to get clear on what the facts are exactly, right? And that's just sort of an empirical question, right? And Kant is like, figure it out, right? And he's probably a little bit naive about how easy it is to figure those situations out, right? And so that could be definitely a hard part of being moral, right? And so I think we can grant that. But the key point, I think, for Kant is that once the facts are in place, or what your judgment should be given the facts as you understand it, that itself he thinks is easy. So getting the facts might be hard, but then the sort of logical side of it, that's the easy part.
But couldn't he, then someone who sort of thinks he's a racist say, well, he's assuming that certain races can't make those factual judgments clear enough. They're not good at sort of determining what the facts are. That's sort of packed into his view of, I don't know, I'm not being articulate, but I think you get the point.
I see what you're saying, yeah. So we would have to think about the kinds of examples, right? How often are the facts a problem here, right? Like a lot of examples, the great vast majority of cases, I think, in our moral lives, we pretty much know what we should do. We just don't want to do it, right? We can come up with elaborate, sort of complicated situations, but I don't think they represent the typical case. And I don't think most people, when they do something wrong, it's because they just haven't properly figured out what the right thing to do is. So there are, of course, examples of that. Most of the times when people do things wrong, it's just because they know what they should do and they don't want to do it. Right? And that's the sort of cases that Kant's interested in. What exactly is going on there, right? So I could see how, yes, if cases where just determining what the facts on the ground are turns out to be really complicated, there would be room on Kant's account for individual and group variation, right? And so his racism could sneak in there. But he doesn't think the vast majority of ethical cases are like that. Yeah.
You used a Kant quote where he talks about the promotion of industry and kind of the building of a society. Do you think that there's a separation between the moral reasoning of where Kant would say someone's subhuman and the building of a society? Or do you think that these things are linked? Like, do you think that if you come to an island nation and they are, like, as we perceive them as lazy and they haven't built great European-style cities, is it linked to their deficit in reasoning, or is it something separate?
It's linked to some sort of material physical difference between them and us, Kant thinks, right? So he thinks, they are, there's some sort of difference that explains, I mean, in different places he'll say different things about this, right? But it's all sort of crackpot pseudoscientific stuff based, he's just cherry picking the reports he got from various voyages and grabbing the stuff he likes, right? But yeah, so he has this thought that for whatever physical reasons, they're lazier than other people, and so they haven't done much with their island, right? And there's no sort of industry, they're not good European, Western European, all that stuff. But he condemns them for that. And by condemning them for that, he is saying they are able to do otherwise. It may be harder for them to do otherwise because they're naturally inclined to be lazier based on his racial views, right? But they still have the reason and freedom to be able to not do that. And that's, otherwise he couldn't condemn them, right? They would just be sort of, you can't condemn people for stuff they can't help doing. He thinks they can help doing it, even though it's harder, right? And this, I think that is an interesting sort of feature of our moral lives, right? It's not all, some of us find doing certain kinds of moral things harder than others, right? And yet, that doesn't necessarily get you off the hook, right? You still might be responsible for it. You just have to sort of tough it out, right? And that's sort of Kant's view. And you have the ability to sort of distance yourself from that desire. No matter how strong it is, reason can kick in and say, don't do it. And you don't have to do it. Is that sort of... Okay. That was impressive.
So one of the passages that you put up there leads me to wonder whether Kant, with his program of heading to a goal of a moral community, imagined that these folks, however biologically handicapped they might be lifted out of their retrograde ways, because it looked like maybe he thought so. That here was a bogus excuse for colonial activities,
right,
that we might uplift them,
right,
and bring them up to our level. And the reason for rejecting it was not they're hopeless. The reason for rejecting it was we would be disrespecting them and violating the basic principle of morality if we trick them in this way.
Yeah, so...
Or beat them up.
Sometimes he says stuff like that. Sometimes, I mean, the anthropological works are all over the place in terms of what he says, and there's also change over time. And so it gets sort of complicated to sort through this. He sometimes seems... He'll do weird things like he'll talk about slavery and he doesn't come right out and reject it, especially early on. And it's a little hard to tell what exactly his view is. And in terms of colonial practices, he sometimes seems to have this vision that eventually the whole world will just be Western European colonies, that's what cosmopolitanism will consist in. But at other places he doesn't, right? And I think his anthropological works are just a mess because of that. Like, it's all over the place. And I don't find them terribly interesting because of that. So in a way, what I'm trying to do is as best I can, it's the good Kant, bad Kant, and try to sort of maintain the boundary, because I just think when he's engaged in that sort of work, it's like all of his worst biases come, because it's so empirical, they just come sort of bursting out, right? But I don't think he has a consistent view on this. It's just sort of all over the place.
You don't have to bring it over. My question is something, just a follow-up on what you said to someone else.
Yeah.
And you said that he's in no position to condemn the Polynesian. But why can't he sort of say, well...
No, he is in position to condemn them.
I thought you sort of said, since they don't have this certain ability, he's not logically, given his view, he cannot sort of say, maybe I misunderstood.
No, it's what shows that they're full moral agents is that he's willing to condemn them, that he does condemn them.
But can't you condemn someone or some action without thinking of them as moral agents? So you take a lion for attacking sort of ego, it's an animal, and sort of saying the action was wrong, they couldn't know any better, and so we can evaluate their action we can even sort of say they do know the right and wrong, but they don't have this ability that we white people have to decide for ourselves. So we have the will, they don't have the will, they just have the judgment.
So some people do talk that way. I think that's really weird. I think it's weird to talk about.
I don't think so at all. I don't yell at my dog. Well, you're with it. All right, your QE did. There we go.
Can I give the example I use in my class all the time? And it involves my wife, and she's here. So what I say is, if my cat, in the middle of the night, eats a plant and pukes it up all over the floor, right? In that situation, I might be aggravated and irritated, but I would never think, you're a morally bad cat,
No, but you
right?
would say the action was annoying, and you would say the action is not conducive to the well-being of your house.
Yeah, but that's not morality. That's what I'm saying. That's just sort of utility or something like that.
Right.
What I'm talking about, I do not morally blame the cat. I do not think the
That's fair.
cat has done anything wrong
agree.
because the cat can't help doing cat things,
Correct.
right? Whereas if my wife were to do the same thing and puke up a bunch of plants on the middle of the floor, I would morally condemn her for that. I would say, what's wrong with you? Why are you eating plants when you know that causes you to puke them on the floor, right? And it's totally different because she has reason and she could step back from her desires and think, should I be acting on this desire? And cats can't do that, and whatever wild animal you mentioned can't do it either.
The move that I made was a little bit different. I didn't say that the Polynesian, I said they couldn't step back, but they still are different than the animal because they have certain principles of right and wrong. So we can still sort of judge them in this kind of way, that the animal doesn't have any knowledge of right and wrong when it does its thing. So we can say the animal is not responsible in that sense, but the Polynesian, we can still sort of like, bad Polynesian for not developing your talents, because you know that that's the right thing. They just don't have the ability.
But, I mean, you could say that, but then you're no longer doing Kantian ethics. If you're doing Kantian ethics, being morally responsible and being able to step back from your desires are co-equivalent. You don't get one without the other. So if you deny that they can step back from their desires through reason, then you're denying that they're morally responsible in a Kantian system. And because he does hold them morally responsible, that does indicate that he thinks they do have reason.
Okay.
Yeah.
When it came to like women, would he include them in the whole being irrational beings, or were they sort of excluded as well?
Yeah, women is a huge problem for Kant in every respect. It's funny, like, in terms of his political views, he's quite clear that they should not be independent and that the husband has control over the wife. And so he's quite willing to not give them full civic status, right? I don't think in the ethical text he ever treats them as morally different. I can't think of an example of that. And it's weird, in the correspondence, he has all these lively, philosophically interesting engagement with certain women. But his official, he's a good Prussian in that sense, and he sort of, in some respects, they might even be worse off in terms of their civic status than non-white men in other countries in terms of his official views. So this is another place where he's sort of conflicted, I think. And anytime you drag Kant into the empirical realm, bad things happen. And this is an example of it, because it's just, I don't know, I mean, whatever his upbringing was, he brought a lot of baggage to the sort of applying the theory. And I think in a way it's even more confusing trying to make sense of his views on women. And whatever we're going to come up with, it's not going to look good for him. Yeah. From New York.
Two questions. One, how much is this determined by Kant's political situation, his employment?
Yeah.
How much is it is lip service to the state, to his employee? And two, how much of this is driven by the notion that there's an imperative that determines all else?
Could you expand on the second question? I understand the first question.
There's an imperative. There's an imperative to progress. There's an imperative to improve ourselves. There's an imperative, so on and so forth. Therefore, we judge others relative to that imperative rather than as is or as in themselves.
So like a sort of teleological, you're looking at sort of where, yeah, I mean, there's something like that going on. Yeah, yeah. Okay, so as far as sort of how much has to do with being bound by the, sort of the state, this definitely came up in his teachings on religion, and he was banned from teaching religion at the end of his life. He was never sort of, he never said anything that got him in too much trouble in this area, and maybe that's because he's bowing to certain pressures. I don't know, but I definitely don't think we could say he's just being a good Prussian and supporting the Prussian cause, and that's why.
He's being practical.
Maybe, except he's so enthusiastic about the racism that I think it's more than just sort of practical necessity.
The racism, which actually the litmus test of the racism would be back to the question of, are these people incapable of achieving this, or haven't they achieved it? And we don't, well, at least in terms of the brief, we don't have any evidence that he says that they're incapable of it. They just haven't. And they haven't for various and sundry reasons. And therefore, he builds a scale from the white man down in terms of this achievement, back to the imperative of progress.
Right, right. Yeah, so, I mean, so he would say they definitely can make progress, otherwise they wouldn't be rational moral agents. He can say something like, it's harder for them because of material difference, physical differences between, right? And so he could say it's more or less likely to happen, and there's sort of hints of that from place to place. But he just clearly is, and has to be, given the theory, open to the idea that, I mean, it just goes with full moral agency, right?
Right, because he's not a materialist.
Right, yeah. I think that's right, yeah.